My guest today is poet Mark McGuinness. Now, Mark is tremendously interesting to me, and as you'll hear in our conversation coming up, he and I like exchanging academic conversations about heady subjects. Mark, however, is quite an accomplished poet. Today, he is the head of another podcast called A Mouthful of Air, which has recently been nominated as one of the best English poetry podcasts in the world. And he also has quite a successful coaching industry where he coaches creative people. Mark himself is a published poet and quite accomplished. And let's drop into a conversation today where we listen to Mark explain what it's like to be a poet, how poetry influences him in every way, and why the lifestyle of poetry, although it's cracked up for him, may not be the right choice for everyone.
To say that you're a poet is, you almost feel like it has to have inverted commas around it. Robert Graves said, it's only ever, for a living poet, it's always a courtesy title. And because real poets are probably few and far between, as history shows us. But actually, when you get down to it, the word poet from Greek, as I'm sure you know, Dan, means maker. And if you hang on to the craft aspect of it, then you don't, that tends to keep the ego in check. And I find this, because my day job, I work with a lot of creatives. A lot of the romantic ideas about creativity tend to, on a Monday morning, it comes down to there's this specific problem that I'm trying to solve. And as long as you stay anchored to that, then I think you don't go far wrong. It is an ongoing debate whether poets are born or made. I just came across a book this morning that was arguing the latter. I don't know. To me, they go hand in hand. That I don't think you really devote the time it takes to write a good poem to poetry unless you feel called to do that in some way, that you really feel drawn to it in a way that people are not necessarily drawn to novels or biographies. But it's also very true that you don't, like most fields of activity, you don't get very far without hard work. And actually, the craft side of thing is endlessly fascinating to me. So it's a combination, I think.
It seems like the problem itself is not crafting the poem. The problem is needing to craft a poem inside. The problem is becoming a poet in a society that doesn't necessarily reward poetry to perhaps the level of financial success and other success that it might warrant. For every Robert Louis Stevenson and Robert Frost for Americans, or Aldens for the British audience, there are tens of thousands of poets who don't reach that level of fame. And so, Mark, you have you have a day job, which keeps you and the poetry going, right?
Yeah, we don't get a seat by the chieftain in the mead hall any often. No, nobody says, okay, now it's time to listen to the poet after dinner. That doesn't tend to happen as much. But, you can see it as a problem, or you can see it as a liberation that most poets realize fairly early on, that it's not going to be their one and only occupation. And it's arguable whether it should be, because, writing lyric poetry at least doesn't take a whole lot of time. It takes a lot of fiddling. You get an initial moment and a burst, and you'll sit down for an hour or two and hopefully get the guts of it down. But then after that, it's just a lot of fiddling and tweaking. And, if anyone was doing a time and motion study of that, it would be hard to quantify. So most poets have had day jobs. In fact, there's a very funny cartoon going around the internet, Day Jobs of the Poets, I think it's called. Philip Larkin, librarian, Wallace Stevens, insurance broker. Even Chaucer, I mean, he was the controller of customs in the port of London. And then he was the surveyor of the king's building works for a while, and yet he wrote reams and reams and reams of stuff, which is...
Shakespeare himself was lucky enough to have his plays produced regularly enough to, I think, keep that as his main occupation, but that's one in a millennium, right?
I mean, Shakespeare is the glorious exception because he's the greatest poet in the English language, and he was also an entrepreneur who wrote for money, among other things. And, I do wonder if that was a coincidence or not, because for most people, it's not viable and it's inadvisable to focus too much on worldly success, but somehow it brought out the best in Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And he was living at a time when poetry was basically the industrial light and magic for the Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre. If you wanted special effects, well, there was no animatronics, there was no laser show. What you did was you got someone who was really good at a blank verse soliloquy, and that would be the thing that elevated your production above your rivals. So it was a great spur for Shakespeare and Marlowe and Webster and his friends to do their best.
How do you compete with industrial light and magic?
Do you know what? I think on the one hand, poetry is a story of failure, because, how many people do you know who rush to buy the latest book of poetry, who could name, the big names in the poetry world, in their part of the world, and yet it stubbornly persists. It doesn't go away. Auden has quite a funny poem where he says, it's a privilege to serve this unpopular art that can't be turned into background music like Mozart, or abridged like Tolstoy, or used as decoration like Picasso or whatever. That he says it stubbornly insists on being read or ignored. So if you engage with a poem either by reading it or listening it, you have to give it your full attention. You can't just sit there and Netflix and chill, or you've missed it. So I do think it says something about the art that it persists in spite of the fact that objectively it probably shouldn't. I mean, it's not practically necessary. There are more exciting and entertaining and better funded entertainment options, even high art options, and yet it persists, and I think that is a really wonderful thing.
Now, among my guests in the podcast, I think you're the only one who's actually been a client and experienced the process that I go through in order to take a story and turn it into a piece of jewelry. And in fact, Mark has a poem that describes his children playing in the backyard, and it is truly a poet's tune. It's short and concise and captures a moment and a feeling. And Mark brought it to me, and I think that it would be good for Mark to share it with the listener today.
Water wheels. Saturday morning, backing up my phone and making copies of your first 6 years for all of us to treasure when you're grown. 11 gigabytes for souvenirs of picnics, bath times, smiles and curls. Scrolling to double check I've copied all the photos, suddenly my eye is caught by a little boy and girl, 2 toddlers sitting in a paddling pool in floppy hats and bathing suit and shorts. I hear your voices as I heard them then, 2 chiming bells in summer from the world outside my study with its curtains drawn to shield a laptop screen. Your laughter called insistently, enticing me to wake from waking dreams of work and venture out. In spite of everything I left undone, I had to take a break to see what all the rumpus was about, and stepped out of the shade into the sun. It felt like entering a photograph just come to life. I passed the stagnant pond, and laughter led me up the garden path to a giant willow waving its car wash fronds above the dazzling pool where you both roared. Your mum and I joined in your shrieks and squeals, dodging your splashes, sharing your delight in the water you both poured from watering cans through spinning water wheels in spangling, coalescing points of light. Even as we were playing by that tree, I felt the moment running through my fingers, the way the water flowed so easily from spouts to pool and back again. What lingers is a memory of joy that brims and spills, of laughter fluid as a game of catch, or those water-powered garden centre toys, the turning wheels and mills, and nodding ducks and chopping lumberjacks that used to hold me spellbound as a boy.
That's a very special poem. And can you talk a little bit about what it was that made you write that?
Yes, it was an exercise in my teacher, Mimi Calvati, who is one of our outstanding poets and has been mentoring me for over 20 years now, I think. And you see, I'm usually terrible at writing exercises where they say, write about your... If I was told write about your children, I would just dry up. Write about somewhere you've been... Anything that's based on a topic or a content. But what Mimi is very good at is finding us a way into the poetic form. Remember the geeking out on the craft. And she sets us these outrageous challenges. And for this one, it was to write a poem in the stanza used by John Keats for his great Ode to a Nightingale.
Right. Which
is one of those kind of benchmark poems that we all stand up and gawp at like it's on a pedestal. But Mimi, she said, have a look at it and see what it is. And what it actually is a sawn-off Petrarchan sonnet. So when Mimi set us this task, I just thought, well, okay, what does that form remind me of? What does it suggest? And my mind did this kind of slow dissolve, and it reminded me of this memory of the children when they were small. And I was, the work-at-home father, slaving away over a hot laptop on one of the baking hot days that we didn't used to get loads of in the UK, but I was still working away because it was a work day. And Mammy, my wife, was out in the garden with the children, and I just kept hearing this laughter, and it was just there in the background, and it just kept calling me. And eventually I thought, okay, let's go and see what's happening. This is going to be more interesting than whatever email I'm dealing with at the moment. And I went out into the garden, and it was a lovely garden with this big willow tree waving its fronds. And at the bottom of the tree was my two twin children, boy and girl, sitting in a paddling pool. And they had these little water wheels that they were just pouring water from a jug into the wheel. Sorry, I'm waving my hands here. You won't see that on the podcast. And it was just such a lovely contrast and a real moment of joy and appreciation, and that's where the poem came from.
Well, and what's special, and what I'm hearing you say right now, is that you were able to take that form and find the joy of your family.
Yeah. One good thing I think about form is it gives the conscious mind something to think about. It's like you've thrown it a bone and it latches onto that, and you're thinking about, and then all the other interesting stuff will kind of come in through the back door. And I really think my job as a poet is to let the poem do its thing with as little interference from me as possible.
So the concept of the dream following the form is one that's relatable to you. But then I arrive with your poem and cross the dictions into a completely different format entirely, which is jewelry.
Yes.
So I'm sitting looking at the ring I've created for you that celebrates this poem. And there will be a picture of this ring certainly in the piece that follows this podcast. But the form for me is actually to take your form away from you and reformat it entirely.
Yeah.
And when Mark approached me with this poem, I approached this poem and I turned it into a ring.
I think probably my favorite thing about the ring is just the pure surprise when you came to me and you said you were doing this, and it had never crossed my mind. I don't know of any poet, I don't even think Shakespeare got a ring made out of one of his poems. And it was just such a lovely thing, unexpected thing, that you had seen this. And that's the lovely thing about the ring, is that you found a way of translating the poem into jewelry. You know, when I wear the ring, every time I look at it, it has a kind of a steadying effect. It reminds me who I am, who we are, like a literal touchstone, you know, for what's important and who's important.
It's the joy that I get as a jeweler, and as you know, and as the listeners learned over listening to the series of podcasts, the reason why I love jewelry the way I do is because it gives me a very special way to help a person understand him or herself. And Mark is a poet. Mark is an industrious person, but he's also a father, first and foremost, and loves his wife very much. And for me to be able to participate in that family in a very small way, even if it's a ring that I drop off and never see again, for me that brings me a lot of joy. And it's the sharing of the joy that actually, I think, builds civilizations. So how is it actually, Mark, that you intend to finish your life's journey in poetry?
To finish it? Well, to me, the poem is not complete until someone else has heard it or read it. You know, I think that's the sharing aspect of poetry. So I have a book that will hopefully see the light next year or the year after. There will be other books after that. I also have my podcast, which is the way I share poems, and mostly they're not my poems. I invite other poets to come along and read a poem. I read poems by people such as Keats. And, you know, the whole point of the podcast is a way of speaking poems and sharing them and recapturing something of the feeling that people maybe used to have in the mead hall when the poet's voice was in their ear. Podcasts, as you know, are a real privilege because you are the voice in somebody's ear in their me time, their quiet time, where they're commuting or relaxing or working out, some people, or cleaning up the kitchen or whatever. And really like having a poem in somebody's ear as a way of, you know, just being as part of their day, as a way to present it. I think the other way that I do it, apart from publishing and podcasting, is reading live, which is always great because then you do get the full mead hall effect of sometimes you can sense the audience's reaction to a piece.
So I have asked all of my podcast guests this particular question. How does solving your poetry problem help you understand yourself today?
Well, I think one reason to write is to discover myself. It's as though there's something that needs to be said or something that needs to be understood, and the usual kind of communication channels are not up to it. Even the usual, you know, I practice meditation, for instance. Poetry, somehow there's still the urge to write something, to articulate something, and to discover it. I mean, I interviewed Mimi, my teacher, once, and we ended up calling the interview Poetry as Discovery, because she said, you know, if it's a real poem, you don't know what's going to happen before you write it. And so self-discovery is a part of that.
Mark, I very much appreciate your time today. I am always standing in awe of your poetry, standing in awe of your language. The concept of discovery is certainly interesting, and very much I love to listen to you shine. It's not so often that you get to hear the creative process from a poet, especially a poet who is willing to describe himself as someone who gets stuck if he's left without structure. I really enjoyed the conversation with Mark, and as a creative person myself, I know what these struggles feel like. Before we wrap up here, I'd like to share something special with you. Now, the jewelry that I make doesn't start with raw materials. It doesn't start at a goldsmith's bench. In fact, the conception of all of the jewelry I make starts in conversation, like the conversation that I had with Mark today. From that conversation, I've written a design brief. And the design brief I wrote over the conversation that I had with Mark is called Unlocking Creativity, the Paradox of Distraction. You can read or listen to me read the full design brief, along with seeing the finished piece of jewelry, renderings, and sketches of the jewelry on my website at theintrepidwendell.com/shine. I'm really looking forward to our next episode, where I'll be talking to my friend, retired federal judge John Olson. John will share with me his deeply moving story about what it means to be honest. And to hear from a man who sits in judgment about honesty is really a privilege. I look forward to seeing you there. Last but not least, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with someone who might love to hear Mark's story. You can go visit our website for more behind-the-scenes content. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing a part of your time with me. My name is Daniel Boettcher, and I love to hear you shine.